So, I would just like to thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Kyle Shavasta. I am a social worker, autistic self-advocate, and a member of the Policy Impact Project. We are a group of researchers and public health professionals whose goal it is to bridge the gap between research and policy. We are a venture of the Policy and Analytics Center at the A.J. Drexel Autism Institute. So that is who we are. I am joined today with my colleague Sam Voltaire, Anne Root, and Kylie McLean, also members of the Policy Impact Project. Today we are pleased to host one of our Policy Power Lunch within the series called Rethinking Research. For this series, we aim to spotlight critical issues impacting people who are autistic, but also in overlooked, over-researched, and groups that may not get the attention they deserve. So today we are focusing on LGBTQ issues. Down the road, we will focus on other issues impacting autistic people and other intersections. Today, we are happy you are all here, and my colleague Sam will go ahead and introduce our panelists.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sam Voltaire. I use she, they pronouns. I also am a social worker and public health practitioner and team member of the Policy Impact Project. So also happy that everyone is here today. So let's get started with some introductions. So our first speaker today, who will be joining us a little shortly, is Lydia X.C. Brown. Lydia X.Z. Brown is a disability justice advocate, organizer, and attorney focusing on issues such as violence against marginalized disabled individuals. Currently, they are co-leading a project on disability rights and algorithmic fairness at Georgetown University Law Center. Lydia has been honored by various organizations and has contributed significantly to community and scholarly publications, as well as news outlets. Our next speaker today is Laura Graham Holmes. Laura is an assistant professor of social work at Hunter College in New York City. She has led community engaged research on sexual and reproductive health services among autistic youth and adults. Her work has centered autistic youth with an emphasis on addressing intersections of autism with injustices and inequities rooted in racism, class-based oppression, misogyny, and homophobia. And our last speaker today is Oluwatobi Ogongonwa. Oluwatobi is an autistic and chronically ill advocate for disability and racial justice and LGBTQ rights. Their academic expertise is in intersectionality and health justice, as well as gender and sexuality. Oluwatobi is the program coordinator at the Autistic People of Color Fund and is involved with local social justice organizations. They currently work as a DEI consultant at a publishing company. So thank you all. So a note before we get started, while we'll be using LGBTQ, you may hear us also use queer and trans interchangeably. We note that that may not always be the practice outside of this space, but for the sake of today's webinar, we may use those interchangeably. So for our speakers, I wanted to ask if you could share your name and your pronouns and share a little about how your work intersects with autistic LGBTQ individuals and their families. So Laura, you're to my left on the Zoom screen, so I'll start with you.
Okay, great. Hello. I'm Laura. My pronouns are she, her. And how my work intersects with autistic LGBTQ people. So I feel like over the years, when I started doing this work in sexual and reproductive health, it was clear that I needed to listen to autistic people because the things I was asking about were not always spot on, and I was getting a lot of great feedback, which I really appreciated. And so over time, I think my work has been more community engaged. And it was also clear that there was just a big population of people who were queer and trans in all of my surveys. And it was so difficult because there's, you don't want to lump everyone together into one category, and there's never enough to really do statistical justice. And so I've started looking for larger data sets where we could really understand how people are doing. And over time, I've generated some data like that from medical records in a work that's going to be published soon. And I hope to create a minority stress intervention for autistic LGBTQ individuals that would be co-facilitated with an autistic trans person, since I'm a queer cis person. So that's how it intersects.
Toby, what about you?
I think most of my work with autistic LGBTQ people is through the Autistic People of Color Fund. The fund is actually a really interesting organization in terms, I feel like it really reflects the overlap between autistic people and like trans people. Like they're just, a lot of autistic people are trans. And so like our leadership in the organization, 4 out of 5 of us are trans people. And I believe it was over half of, we did a survey a couple of years ago, and over half of our respondents, people that have applied and our grantees, they like over half of them were trans. So a lot of being LGBTQ friendly and like centric is really built into the process of the APOC fund. We're very understanding that people like have different names might change. So yeah, it's really, I enjoy the work I get to do of like, I'm primarily the one who is like directly interfacing with our applicants and our grantees. And it's really lovely to connect with like other autistic trans people, even only for like, maybe 10 email or, back and forth. But yeah, that is most of the work that I do.
Thank you both for sharing. So we're gonna dive into some of the questions that we have here today. And so this first one generally looks at this area that we're calling identifying needs and issues for queer and trans autistic individuals and their families. And this is the question. So many autistic youth and young adults have needs for services or care that are unmet. In your experience, what are the greatest needs within this population? And what issues do you hear about the most?
I really, I think that housing, like job security, employment, like financial stability, and especially like housing security. A lot of autistic people have, like, with the way like the realm of like professionality is kind of like set up, it's very exclusive of autistic people, and especially autistic like trans people. Like we're just not the professionals that like people are looking for like when they want to like hire. And also like a lot of like the job norms, like once like we are hired, like we are like often fired and let go because we don't fit into like the company culture, or like we like to work alone, and like we don't prefer to like have lunch meetings or whatever with like other people. We like me time. So I think a lot of like the requests that we do get through the Autistic People of Color Fund, a lot of them are like people who are housing insecure, and a lot of them are like trans people. So I would say that like economic stability, and then that directly impacting housing is like the most urgent issue that I'm seeing for the folks that I'm interacting with.
Laura, what are you seeing in your experience?
Yeah, I really appreciate that on the ground perspective. I think in sort of the realm of academia, something that comes up is healthcare. And so so there's a great paper by Hall and colleagues from 2020 where they found that queer and trans autistic adults were more likely to be turned away by healthcare providers than were cisgender heterosexual autistic adults, even though they had the same insurance status. Maybe because providers feel like this is not within their scope of practice, which it absolutely is. And so I think that's, to me, just, the healthcare system is already so difficult to navigate, and being turned away from providers has got to make it a lot more difficult. And I also just wanted to mention something that Dr. James Shelton is one of my colleagues at Silberman, and they were talking recently about how, thinking to yourself, have I ever received gender affirming care? And they ask, have you gone in and have people just like say your pronouns and treat you like your pronouns are absolutely normal and typical? Then you've had gender affirming care. And so thinking about how cisgender heterosexual people receive gender affirming care all the time in healthcare, and how can we extend that to queer and trans people, I think also came to mind for this question.
That's awesome. Thank you both. I appreciate the specificity there in those answers, because oftentimes we hear in the rhetoric that we use, like, queer rights are human rights, trans rights are human rights. But first, let's define what basic human rights are, and that's housing and healthcare. And I think, like, we need to reorient ourselves away from platitudes and be more action oriented. So I appreciate the specific examples you both gave. And that actually leads to our next question in regards to addressing the unique challenges for queer and trans autistic people. What would you say is unique about the challenges mentioned compared to autistic people who don't identify as queer and trans? So where are the juxtapositions there? What are the differences we're seeing?
If you want to handle that first, Laura, I'll defer to you. Still.
Okay. I'm happy for you to go first on all the questions, by the way. It's, I think just thinking back to my last response, I think that it almost adds another layer to the perception of separation from the norm. And so providers are thinking, they need specialty training, or maybe they don't have time to learn how to provide adequate care or something like that. So that came to mind for me. But I think also something that we're seeing is maybe more complex mental health conditions and medical conditions, both due to trauma and the physical effects of stigma and minority stress on the body. So in this study that I mentioned with using medical record data, which is sort of like, where do we find a good sample of people where we can really do comparisons? That one has been used a lot in the LGBT research world. So so we found higher rates among queer and trans autistic people compared to cisgender heterosexual people of chronic pain conditions, GI conditions, headaches, migraines, and some autoimmune conditions. And this was a sample of fairly young adults, like in their, the mean age was like in the 20s. I think sleep, substance use, mental health conditions not being adequately treated could all mean that this is a more complicated group. And I think also, I don't think there's a lot of good research on this, but I do think that we know that, queer and trans people have experienced a lot of family rejection. And I don't know how that plays out for autistic people, but I think it also happens there. I had a little tiny bit of research that showed like family relationships were poorer among queer and trans autistic adolescents compared to others. And so I think that maybe people are not benefiting from the family support that many autistic people do benefit from. So maybe there's a difference there as well in terms of like navigating the healthcare system and, staying on parents, health insurance and things like that, especially when we're thinking about, what Tubby said about people having difficulties, getting and maintaining employment. So that comes to mind for me. I also just think, my class at Silberman School of Social Work is one of the only of maybe 5 or 6 continuously running classes on intellectual and developmental disabilities in the country in a school of social work. And, social workers are really a critical, you guys know, a critical workforce when it comes to, supporting disabled people. Yet, in 2024, they're still receiving very little training in disability policy, justice, or just basic understanding of conditions like autism. And then I was also thinking about this conversation with James Shelton and S.J. Dodd, where, we think of social work as a really queer and trans inclusive profession. And I think it is compared to like psychology, which is my home profession, or other professions, but there's still a ton of advocacy happening, even at my school in New York City, to ensure that trans students are respected and included. And so when you layer those pieces together, I think you begin to get a sense of what it's like to navigate the system. And then if you layer in race or ethnicity and socioeconomic status, it's just, more of those layers. So yeah.
Yeah, I just like to just echo everything Laura said. And I think one thing that I see in my work with the APOC Fund, and one thing that I see is, while like most of like the emails that I'm like receiving and like talking to people, like, like we talk about, like, rent and like housing and like care, like healthcare and all that stuff, we do get like a significant amount of like emails asking about community, especially from like trans, autistic, like people of color. A lot of the folks that like I'm hearing from are like trans POC who are only like recently like learning that they are autistic, like finally finding that answer to be like, oh, this explains all this stuff, and there are like a lot of like community spaces for autistic people are very like white, and they're very cis, they're very heterosexual, and so it can be really hard to like find that kind of like baseline support network that they need. People might also come from like, especially if you're like in like the LGBTQ community, like you might be estranged from like family members, even if you are like together. If you're a person of color, like they might not like, there might be like a different understand, like a lack of acceptance about like autism, and like seeing it in like very like problematized like light, instead of like understanding it as like just a way of existing. So I think that I see a lot of people like seeking community, and unfortunately it is not like our organization, like we do advocacy work, we do like policy work, and we do like community, like direct mutual aid kind of funding, but like we don't have like an arm for like community spaces. So I direct like a lot of people to Facebook groups, and also like going from those groups like to finding like real world spaces. I think an interesting thing though that I have found, and I don't like, I'm mostly going off of personal experience, and like, yeah, mostly going off personal experience and experiences like of people in my circles, my virtual and like in-person circles. But like, I feel like, I don't know, I feel like I know like a lot of autistic people like tend to be trans, but I feel like also like a lot of LGBTQ people tend to be neurodivergent. Like most of like the people that I'm interacting with, who are like, I have like a lot of like Black autistic friends, and like, they're lesbians and they're bisexual and they're non-binary. And so I do think that like, if you are in a space to like explore your identity like fully, and if you are in a space where there's like, I don't know, I see a lot of like, there's a lot of possibility for like belonging, and a lot of like opportunity to like realize that, whoa, like I don't know, sometimes it feels like when you like take so many boxes, like you're just like, what am I, like a list of like, conditions, diagnoses, or like, whatever. So I think that like it does, like there are like opportunities, I think maybe more than people like might assume, depending on like where you live, honestly, for to find community with other like neurodivergent, other autistic, like trans, LGBTQ folks.
Can
Yeah.
Can I share? What you said about the groups really resonated with me because we were my colleague Liliana Balbano and I. Liliana has an MSW and is my peer facilitator for this project. And we're facilitating these substance use disorder groups. And we had some good outcomes from that. And you just made me think of one person who came and was like, I'm a Black trans autistic person. I want to quit smoking, but I smoke in public because the other ways that I stim can be dangerous for me. And I'm not sure whether your group is going to have other Black trans autistic people or even Black autistic people who are going to really understand and be able to sort of connect about that. And Liliana and I tried, and it's hard. It's hard to find ways to do the outreach for these groups and also to have people feel comfortable, especially when both of us are white running it. And so that person didn't complete the group, and I just I hope there's some solutions for that. It just, I really want everything to be more inclusive. So we made sure that we interviewed that person to find out like what would have been more helpful for you, and interviewed as many people as we could to figure out how to improve the group. But anyway, yeah, that really resonated.
So you all, Toby, you were going to say something?
Sorry, just like to add something. What you were saying, Laura, just reminded me. Like, I think for like a lot of for a lot of autistic people who are trans and of color, their autism is often stigmatized in a different way. There's like I don't know, there's a more, well, for example, like a lot of like Black autistic people tend to get like initially like misdiagnosed as having bipolar disorder or being like schizophrenic. And I feel like there's a lot of there's a lot of the ways that like people who are like cishet like white men, like how they like present their autism can often be misunderstood essentially. So I think that like that is another like a barrier to like care, and also like an easy like funnel into like the psychiatric like industrial complex where like people can essentially be incarcerated for, I don't know, being existing in ways that like people think like they shouldn't.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, both of you. And you all also talked about the community piece, which leads right into our next question very well when thinking about like the LGBT community and queer autistic folks. Would you all say that there are issues within the LGBTQ community that impact autistic people differently than their non-autistic peers? So yeah, I leave that question to you all.
I can speak to I always think back to this interview that I did when I was doing a larger quality of life study, maybe like 5 years ago, so not that long ago in my opinion. And it was with a gay 50-year-old autistic man who said, like, I I feel like I'm not really accepted in the autistic groups that I'm part of because I'm gay, and maybe because I'm older also, and a lot of people are younger because of just how diagnosis has played out over the years. And then I'm not really accepted in the gay community because I behave in ways that they, are different from what they're expecting sometimes, and I might not look like the ideal. I mean, this is not an autistic thing, this could be anyone, but like I don't feel like I look like the ideal of what people are idolizing in the gay community, and so it makes it difficult for me to make connections in either one. And you said like there's such a possibility for belonging because there's these different communities, and yet there's also this like extra possibility for, I feel like, being marginalized from multiple communities. So anyway, that person always is on my mind.
I don't know. I'm trying to think of something that like that speaks to something that like Laura and I haven't already said yet. Um, I think well, I think one easy one to like point back to is like housing discrimination. Um, I um I also think that like another thing that I see is like just I think that autistic people and like LGBTQ folks, some of us have like affectations. I don't even know. Like there are ways that like you can like essentially clock us in person. And I think that like that definitely makes autistic LGBTQ folks like more at risk for like interpersonal like violence that is like, and also like harassment and like discrimination. There is like just like I feel like extra othering, like if you are like able to like if you're like able to be like unmasked in public and also like being your very like authentic self, like that can really like paint like a larger target on your back essentially. And I think that there's also I think on like the like very like personal side, I think I see a lot of autistic like a lot of like autistic LGBTQ folks like feeling like they are like too much. Like there is because as we like are raised like from childhood like from babies all the way to adulthood, we are just very much like told that these are I think a lot of people have to learn the like coming into their authentic self kind of thing. And I think that like that's a process that like takes a lot of years, like many years and like consistent like work. And it can be hard to like reconcile the fact that like who you truly are is different from like what society says you should be. And even when you do know that like you should be your like full self, it can still be like hard to like fight against those like um natural instincts, like instincts that have been like implanted in you from birth and like in society and all of that. So I think that a lot of people like there's like I see a lot of like autistic like I see a lot of like autistic folks coming into like LGBTQ identities, like I think maybe more openly, just because they're. But I see then like having to hold their like full self like can be very difficult and like often like requires like strong community. And if you're like in a rural area or if if you're in like you know certain states like that can be difficult to access, which of course like results in like mental health problems and also like just general health kind of issues.
Could I also say about, yeah, I really liked, I think Sam and Kyle, one question that you sent us was about like alienation from the two communities, the autistic and LGBT communities, and how what can be done to alleviate that. And Oluwatobi, what you said just now about being in a rural area makes me think about a person. Sorry, I have all these people in my mind who I've been talking to, but makes me think of a person I spoke to recently who was in a rural state. And they described, I mean, the mental health care situation was really dire, and they had pretty significant PTSD from an abusive relationship, which is a huge problem for this community, I think. And they had tried some peer groups, but the like grasp of socioeconomic class, and the ability to problem solve with people around things that didn't cost money was difficult for them, and it. And I hope if anyone here is part of a group like that, or starts a group like that one day, you know, just having a lot of time to think about privilege and how to make it inclusive for everyone. Um, you know, because I think that the systemic issues that you're bringing up are really, really relevant for this population.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. One, I just want to thank you both for answering that question expertly. It's a big question, so I appreciate your thoughtfulness, and I think Laura, to put a finer point on your point, it's not so much enough to meet people where they are. We have to meet people where they live and where they are inhabiting. How do we not just like meet people in their communities, but meet people in their homes, meet people where they receive services, really truly, meet people and serve people and also create a safe, inclusive environment. So I appreciate you bringing us there. And to that question, it's a hard question. What do LGBTQ people, autistic people experience that their non-autistic peers experience? I think like the most simplest answer, from my experience, is ableism. Ableism in the LGBTQ community is something that I think regularly needs to be addressed and talked about. So I just want to kind of add that in there, if that's okay. But from one big question to another huge question, I apologize. Thank you both for being such wonderful sports here with these. This is about policy. We want to analyze how politics, policies, and current events impact autistic people. It's a big thing to talk about right now, but it's important. So in the US, it seemed like we went through a really open, inclusive period where policymakers and policy making felt more supportive of LGBTQ issues, supporting and funding gender affirming care, gay marriage. But since the adoption of queer and trans inclusive policies, we've witnessed a insurgence of anti-LGBTQ policies and specifically anti-trans policies. We are also seeing the election of people with publicly hostile anti-queer and anti-trans views into state legislatures, as well as above that in the House and Senate, unfortunately. What are your thoughts about the impact of this type of political environment on queer and trans autistic people, and where can we go forward? That was big. Take all the time you need to process that.
I have a research-based answer. Do you want me to go first, or do you want to go first? Okay, all right. So I think there's been a good decade or two of research on the connection between structural stigma like this, societal views and policies and laws with health now. Mark Hatzenbuehler is one of the people that's led this research. And if you read it, it's really interesting and well done. But so we know that the structural stigma that you're describing deeply affects the health of queer and trans people. So it's it's intimately connected to these individual level stigma processes that affect health, like concealment of sexual orientation or concealment of HIV status. So we know that is more likely in communities that have higher structural stigma. Studies have gone through and characterized state by state policies and attitudes towards queer and trans people. And they've linked those with health processes like fear of being rejected, based on being queer and trans, and health outcomes like greater tobacco use and alcohol use and things like that. We also know that these like high structure environments, when we do interventions in those environments, like trying to increase the use of condoms, for example, they don't work. They work in low stigma environments, but not in these high stigma environments, which is a huge problem, right? Like we're almost like our public health interventions aren't working in the places where we almost need them to work the most. And there's also evidence, of course, of direct effects on mental health conditions, right? So states without hate crime statutes and employment discrimination laws have queer people with higher rates of psychiatric conditions. So if we can just make that link. There's also like longitudinal data over time. So queer people who live in high structural stigma communities have a life expectancy of 12 years shorter on average than people who don't. And that's similar to people with and without a high school degree. So that's a huge difference. And then, suicide, homicide, cardiovascular diseases are among the top reasons why that's true. And I think, and I just following the work of Monique Botha, I wonder what it's like when we look at disability policy like this too, like what is the structural stigma effect of various disability policies on people's health? And what's the effect of being in a place where there's high stigma on both of those? I don't know. There's also a lot less research on how this affects trans health versus queer health. So I think that is an area of interest, and I hope I hope it does something. All of this research, like I hope it's compelling for people to rethink some of those laws. I still remember reading Susan Faludi's book Backlash when I was like a research assistant like 12 years ago, about how policies move forward in this zigzag kind of pattern. So I have hope, but it's really rough right now. And I know that like the gender clinics in New York City are seeing an influx of autistic trans people from other states coming. And just imagine having to travel that far for any kind of care that you desperately need, to stay alive. It's yeah. So anyway.
I think just like going off that last point about like having to travel for care, I think that is something that like, so I'm a trans person who is like receiving like gender affirming care and like considering like other options for gender affirming care. And like when I learned that like it was normal for people to have to like fly somewhere else and like pay for a hotel to like access I was like, this is ridiculous. I mean, I finally like accepted it because that's just the America that we live in. But I'm like, that is so wild that like these opportunities are so rare. And if you don't have the money, like paying for these procedures are already like very expensive. So if you don't have the money to like go to another state, and then pay to like live there for like a week or two. And then also like who's going to be taking care of you during that time? Like, are you going to have like someone fly out? Like, do you have any people in the area? But yeah, I think that like, I think one of the immediate, so I live in Tennessee. I think one of like the things that I've been seeing, well, I think I'll start off with like how a lot of some of the bills around like that are like restricting gender affirming care have like specifically like mentioned autistic people. And I think that like points to the fact that like, which is like really weird for me, that like these lawmakers like know that like they understand the connection between autistic and trans people. Like that was very like puzzling for me to like realize. But also that like these attacks are like about like bodily autonomy. Like the right is trying to like control people's bodies, because when you I mean that's how you control the population. Like you decide who lives and who dies, who gets food, who gets housing, who like yeah, I mean, yeah. So it's very I think that's one oh, I think honestly like looking back at the last question, that is like one thing that like autistic LGBTQ folks experience that like other LGBTQ folks don't, like a higher policing of our bodies. I in Tennessee and in like other southern states, but I'll speak mostly for Tennessee. A lot of folks are like fleeing the state. I have a lot of friends who like no longer live here. I have a lot of I know like of like a lot of providers, a lot of like advocates and organizers like who are leaving, who are like taking their work elsewhere. Yeah, and it's very sad. Like I am staying in Tennessee. I really feel that like Nashville is like an organizing home, a like a community kind of like space for me. But I can't be upset at folks who like need to like leave the state to like take care of themselves, to make sure like the care that they're receiving like does not it doesn't go away. And I'm not sure if this news like made it out of the state, but Vanderbilt University Medical Center is like the biggest like medical care provider in the state, and like is like the largest employer. And as like when anti-trans bills were like ramping up in like the Tennessee legislature and in like just in the federal legislature, they like essentially kind of like gave the names of like trans people like to the government like on an ask. So we are seeing like medical providers like medical institutions like not supporting. So we are like autistic trans folks, autistic LGBTQ folks are getting no support from like anywhere, like anything that is like established and like institutional. And so what I have seen and like what I am doing is that like we're creating like our own systems. Like folks have, I think this is something that like, I mean, we've been doing this for years, like, you know, like we're the people who support us. But I think even more now, like a lot of like mutual aid hubs are like popping up. I'm part of Trans Aid Nashville that gives, you know, grants and like resource support to trans, non-binary GNC folks in the Nashville area. And I'm seeing like food networks kind of popping up, like housing networks. A lot of folks are getting more interested in the LGBTQ like land projects that are happening in rural Tennessee that have been happening for years. So I'm really seeing like, for the folks like who are able to stay, like we are trying to build outside of these institutions to make sure that like our people are taken care of. And that's something that it's difficult work. And especially like when you know the reason we're having to do this is because the things that should be working for us aren't. So yeah, so simultaneously like very like uplifting, but also like very demoralizing.
I was just also thinking about, you know, what is the effect of these laws on children growing up, trying to figure themselves out? What is the effect of these laws on families? We know that family rejection of LGBT people is associated with higher rates of suicide, higher rates of HIV, of unprotected sex. And I know I have a study of I think it's about 2,000 young people who were recruited through social media. And they over-recruited, this is a group from Pitt Psychiatry, they over-recruited trans people. And so of course they have a bunch of autistic people in there. So I partnered with them to figure out how people are doing. And the main focus was on suicide, and they have a pretty comprehensive suicide measure. And so we can see that when we're controlling for a lot of the things that you would expect to affect suicide, there's still a connection between, you know, autistic, the trans people who are autistic have higher rates of suicidality across the board. So suicide ideation, attempts, and attempts requiring medical care, so more lethal attempts than the trans people who are not autistic. So it's really important. It's like life or death, you know, this kind of stuff. So.
And thank you both for sharing and commenting about like how the political landscape like directly impacts the like lived experience of queer and trans autistic people. And monitoring the time, we also know there are some folks who have questions in the Q&A section on Zoom who would like, we want to open that to them too. So I have one final question for you all before we open that up, but thinking about making actionable change, what is a policy related action or actions that everyone who is in attendance right now can do to improve the lives of queer and trans autistic people? And I know that's also like a big question, so feel free to take your time.
I'm good to go first on this. I would say like I just want to like I don't know, press an emphasis on like getting involved in like local government, like local politics, local like legislature, because that's like really where like we're able to like enact the most change. I don't know, if people are all like working within their communities to like make their communities like safe and like resource heavy for like everyone who needs it, like then all communities are like that. It can feel really demoralizing when we look at like the candidates for like president or like current and past presidents, and it can feel just really like there is no hope. And I don't like, since we're talking about policy, I'm like mentioning local like electoral politics. But I am like, I think the work that I am doing, like I'm really like divesting. Like I am like trusting the other folks who are in my community to like do that work while I am like doing the work of like building other like ways to like take care of folks. But yeah, I would say that like getting involved on the local level, I feel like is like the best way to like enact change. And especially like when you do like small local campaigns and like when you like are successful with those, like it also like empowers folks to like and kind of like yeah, empowers folks to like keep doing this work. So I would say like yeah, get involved on the local level, like be in your legislature, like you know, just kind of all of that.
I love that. I think the biggest thing for people who are researchers or healthcare providers or people who are, you know, in organizations, is just talk and consult with queer and trans autistic people. You know, make sure they're part of your advisory boards, ask their advice about your clinic protocols, your practice, you know, whatever continuing education you can find in this area is going to make you a better, you know, provider, and just thinking about who is at the table and who's not at the table when decisions are being made that affect autistic people, or when research is being done that is, you know, meant to support autistic people.
Thank you both for answering that question. And so now I think we'll open it up to Q&A if we could get Kylie on.
Ooh, actually,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was wondering, I honestly I would like to like hear Lydia's like thoughts on this last question, if y'all don't
yeah.
mind.
Lydia, I'll ask the question again, but we were asking what policy related action can everyone in attendance today do to improve the lives of queer and trans autistic people?
Oh no, that's like a really big question to ask of folks because we're coming under attack from so many different quarters right now. And, you know, one thing that I would really like to encourage people to do just in general is take an inventory of where you are, right? Like, where do you work? Who are the communities that you work with? Who do you have a relationship with? Because there's probably action that you can take from within that specific, from that specific position already. Just in, you know, changing policies to create an environment that sends a message of welcoming versus one that is hostile, that is, if you are in a position where you have greater access to power, perhaps in an employment context, that might look like revising policies around paid leave, medical leave, family leave, parental leave, and so on. It could look like, if you are a person who supports people on an everyday basis, thinking through what kinds of opportunities you make available, what kinds of connections and referrals you can make, whether those offices actually have any cultural responsiveness or competency around queer, trans, and autistic people's experiences, and so on, and asking too who you collaborate with, who you compensate for their time and their expertise. And so, for example, if you're a person that runs a program, are the only times that you engage with queer and trans autistic people in the context of asking us to participate on unpaid, uncompensated advisory committees, where our input may in fact be genuinely welcomed, but is not part of a decision-making process. And it is going back to people who are paid actual salaries for working on a project. So who are you compensating? Who are you actually bringing on in a regular capacity? Who do you actually support as a partner, and so on? But then also think broadly, right? If you're a person that engages in the legislative process, locally, state, or nationally, let alone if you were engaged in international human rights work, for example, then it's also an opportunity to question how the policies you are working on are or are not able to meet the needs of or better support queer and trans people and autistic people, separately as well as together, right? So for example, if you are working on access to reproductive health care, then are the measures that you are working on inclusive of queer and trans people's reproductive health care needs? Are the measures you are working on attentive to the needs of disabled people who may also need to access abortion care or would like to explore different ways of starting families and having children, or of being supported as new parents? Right? Like, these are all aspects of reproductive health care. And if that's an area that you're working in, then that's something worth considering too. If you are working in an area where you think, I don't know what this has to do at all with sexuality or with disability, I guarantee you that it does. Like, whether it is you are exploring issues of who has access to transportation, or who has access to banking services, or who has access to counseling around student loans, or who has access to what kinds of hair care products, right? Like, all of these are issues that impact humans, right? And queer and trans autistic people are in that group of humans. And we also have particular needs. For example, being able to interface with a financial institution where we don't feel like we have to justify or explain a partner to whom we may or may not be married, and where our gender presentations may not align with heteronormative expectations of what a couple is supposed to look like. Or being able to access transportation might also mean, right, like having safe access to transportation and knowing that the driver or the conductor is not going to harass us, knowing that the elevators and the platforms are accessible, knowing that the machines where you have to buy tickets or the apps that you use to track your trips are designed for sensory, cognitive, and physical access needs for the users that are interfacing with them. And knowing that, for instance, if people are accessing transportation, that can mean the difference between having a robust transportation network where a person can actually go to a gender affirming support group, or a person is able to see the provider who can write the letter for them to have approval for gender confirming surgery, or where they can meet with a therapist who will help them understand and explore their sexuality and their gender identity, right? So like, every single thing that you might think of as some issue that you have worked on or some area in which you are engaging, even if you think, I don't know what this has to do with queer, trans, and autistic people, I guarantee you that it does, because we are humans who also deserve to have the full panoply of human experience.
If I could just add one last thing to that, I think that a fight that I have seen on, like, in different, like, generations of trans people is like getting your, like, workplace insurance to, like, include gender affirming care. And I feel like that is a very, like, I'm not saying it's an easy fight, but it's one that is, like, very accessible. Like, looking at, like, your health insurance, like, policy and being like, what is, like, offered here? And like, especially if you're like a cis person, like, advocating advocating for the insurance to be, like, widened so that, like, trans people who, like, work there now, or even if there are no trans people who work there currently, like, there will be in the future, like, possibly. So like, that work is also for them.
Yes, thank you all. I know that was a really big question, but all three of you all were able to, like, really break it down for us. So I really, really appreciate that so much. Kylie, if you can come on screen, maybe we can take one or two questions.
Yep, thank you so much. And keep them coming in here if you have any other questions. But we have a commissioner from the city of Dallas on the Commission of Disabilities, who asked a question in reference to gender care and medical practice. Applications don't always ask, what pronouns you prefer? And for privacy and protection, many don't self-report and identify per their birth gender. So when you mention gender care, this would be applicable to PCPs, NPs, whereas born male would not go to an OBGYN. So would it be fair to identify what medical practice? Is it ER rooms and regular doctor's appointments?
This is Lydia. I would encourage, just in general, to only ask for information related to sex assigned at birth, or what specific reproductive organs or genitalia a person might have, if it is medically necessary in that context. And so, for example, even in a particular setting, it's not universally needed. If you come to the ER because you're having a heart attack, it is irrelevant what genitalia you have, what chromosomal arrangement you have, what reproductive organs you were born with. And if you've had any form of gender confirmation surgery done to you, right? Because you're having a heart attack. It's a myocardial infarction and it needs to be treated. And the treatment for myocardial infarction does not depend upon what your assigned gender at birth was. Now, follow-up it could become relevant depending on other risk factors, but your PCP likely knows this information if they are a trustworthy person that you've built a good relationship with, and you will be sent upon discharge back to your PCP because you had a heart attack. And it would be your PCP's responsibility to follow up with aftercare that perhaps could be implicated by your sex assigned at birth. Another example, you come into the ER and you have like 5 broken bones. Well, we can avoid transgender broken arm syndrome here. Like, it is irrelevant what your gender is and what your gender presentation is. You've got 5 broken bones. Like, that's what needs to be treated. On the other hand, if you come into the ER and you're experiencing multi-organ systemic failure and unknown concerning neurological symptoms that are not your baseline, I think it would be good medical practice to inquire about things like hormones, like what your birth hormones were, and perhaps reproductive organs if one of them potentially could be rupturing, for instance, because in that scenario, there is more of a medical mystery. And in that ER situation, it may be medically prudent to inquire after that information. But in other settings, in general, it's not relevant. If you're seeing an orthodontist, they don't need to know whether or not you're transgender, what your sex assigned at birth was. On the other hand, if you are seeking reproductive related health care, it's probably very relevant what reproductive organs you do and don't have, and what organs you may have been born with, because that will affect what your options are regardless of the specific care that you're receiving. It might determine what kinds of cancer screenings that you should be undergoing routinely, as well as what your options are for procreation if you are seeking to be able to procreate, or if you would like to be voluntarily sterilized because you don't want it to be an option to be able to procreate. Well, it literally matters what kind of sterilization is being done. Is this a vasectomy? Is this a hysterectomy? Like, they don't know if you don't tell them. They will need that information. So, in response to your question, I would say that best practice does dictate that context matters, both in terms of specialty, type of procedure or treatment being sought, as well as what are presenting symptoms, if any, if a person is showing up to a new office. But even where it might be medically prudent to inquire after the information, it would be important for staff to understand that there could be a number of reasons why a patient might still decline to disclose the information, even if it would be medically prudent to ask for it. And they shouldn't be dismissed as a non-compliant patient and then denied access to care for declining to provide that information.
Another thing I would add to that oh my gosh, we're getting so close to time, is on pronouns. Before you add pronouns to your healthcare database or to the process, you have to make sure folks should be trained before that implementation happens. You don't want to throw trans people into an unsafe environment. Essentially, that's it.
And I'll illustrate what Oluwatobi just said. I once went to a community health clinic that was publicly advertised as specifically catering to the transgender, gender nonconforming community. And so I went to that clinic for that reason, to seek medical care, expecting, based on their website, their stated mission, that they would be a welcoming and supportive place for me as a trans person. And despite that, the provider that I saw repeatedly misgendered me, used incorrect pronouns, used gendered language that was very dysphoric for me to hear being used over and over again, despite being corrected, and used multiple highly gendered terms to address me and to talk about me. And, to me, that was actually a much worse experience than going into a doctor's office where they did not espouse a commitment to gender affirming or a gender supportive environment, and then they made the mistake. Because in the one environment, I was expecting to be responded to appropriately and respectfully, and then was not. And in the other environment, I don't necessarily have an expectation. So I am not going to be as disappointed, frustrated, or hurt if someone on the staff ends up misgendering me in an environment where they weren't purporting to be supportive of and welcoming to people from the TGNC community. And so to, agree with and underscore Oluwatobi's comment, if you are asking for pronouns, if you are attempting to publicize, we try to support and welcome trans and gender nonconforming people here, you need to follow through. And that needs to not just be performative or superficial. If you are asking for pronouns, then you need to work on correctly using the pronouns people have asserted, even if they do not match your preconceived notions of what someone who uses those pronouns might look like. And as a matter of, in addition to that, a practical matter of safety, it's important for medical providers to also consider, are these the pronouns we should use to talk about you if we call you and someone else answers the phone? Because people may not necessarily be out to everyone in their life. Like someone might be 20 years old, they're a legal adult, and they can see their own providers, but they still live at home with a family that is not accepting or to whom they have not come out. And so they have bravely asked to be referred to correctly with she, her pronouns as a trans feminine person. But if you call home and their parent answers, they would like to be referred to as a he, him to their parent, as opposed to being outed. Because that can occasionally, with the best of intentions, end up backfiring, where staff that are trying very hard to affirm and respect someone's identity inadvertently out them to people to whom they are not out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. These are really pertinent reminders for everyone in attendance, and thank you for all. We are just about at time. We are at time. I just wanted to open up the floor to all the panelists to provide us with any last thoughts or words for our audience. And thank you everyone for going on this chat with us. And I will open up the floor. Laura, any final thoughts?
I'm responding to this question about measures and how we deal with the fact that our measures have major limitations. A lot of them are like sex normed, and just thinking about making sure that we are transparent about the limitations of our assessments and our practice with people. And also, again, like getting that consultation, like if you have queer and trans autistic people, and I think especially trans autistic people, read these measures and anything is distressing on the measures, like don't use that. I was reading one of these like really widely used measures out loud to participants on the phone for one of the studies, and I was like, this is so ableist. Like I feel bad reading this to the person and asking these questions. Like I'm not using this measure anymore. And so just talk to people and just have their best interest in mind.
Wonderful. Thank you. Oluwatobi?
Yes, I would say like on that like note of like talking to people, I really encourage people to like get to know the narratives of autistic LGBTQ folks. Like I don't know, like read articles, blog posts, like follow people on social media who share about these experiences. I think it's very important to like this is not just I don't know, like change is not only necessary for autistic LGBTQ folks, but it's necessary in like the larger society. So like, I don't know, like acquainting yourself like with the truths of our experiences, the multiple truths, and just like realizing that like we are not just some like, I don't know, like a multi-marginalized like idea, but like we are like actual people who you likely have interacted with before. So just kind of, learning about us from us.
Absolutely. And Lydia, close us out if you would.
This is Lydia. I would just really encourage you all to, as Oluwatobi is suggesting, continue your own learning, but also prioritize building relationships, right? And I say that because learning and growing is a lifelong process, and also building relationships is a lifelong imperative too. And the only way that we are able to know, are we being accountable to the community? Are we attending to the community's needs? Are we being responsive to what the community actually desires? Is to be in regular relationship with the people who are impacted, whether they are leaders of organizations, they are individual advocates, they are your neighbors, and so on. Because, one person doesn't necessarily represent all of our experiences. One person and another might disagree, and that is fine and normal because no community is a monolith. And there are things that most of us tend to agree on, right? But you won't know that if you are not prioritizing building relationships. And this goes for any area in which you are realizing I have a lot to learn and I want to improve on how supportive my work is and how much my policy advocacy or my research incorporates the perspectives of people in a particular marginalized group. And if you're like, I don't know where to begin, or I'm not sure how well we're doing and what we need to improve on, then that's an invitation to consider, how can I build a relationship? And if you're thinking, well, I don't want to build a relationship that's exploitative or extractive, I don't want to build a superficial or a tokenizing relationship, don't do that. But do the research, ask around. You can find podcasts, you can find TikTok channels, you can read books, you can go online and find forums. If you are still old enough to be on Facebook, which apparently is a group that I am in, old enough to be on Facebook, which is very weird to say, right? Like you can find Facebook groups and pages. There are media in every possible version or modality for you to access to learn who is already writing and speaking about this topic, about this group, about this community. Who are the organizations? What are the projects being led by people from within this community? And that's an invitation to you to show up, to be present, whether that's in an online space, in an in-person space, whether that is through joining a committee, whether that is through giving a $3 monthly donation, right? Reddit, another great source that Laura mentioned, right? Like whether it is through reading and falling down the rabbit hole to find out, okay, well, now I've seen 5 different people mention this one book. Maybe I should read the book, and maybe I should read the works cited in the back of the book. Or if reading is not as great for you, find the audiobook version or skim the book, or just look at the bibliography and see what they list for podcasts that are available to check out. And take note of the organizations, the groups, the projects, the campaigns that are mentioned, and connect with them. Follow their newsletters. You can't read 100 emails a day, but you can read 1, maybe 2, right? And prioritize accordingly. Like, this is a community that you want to learn more about. Find the groups that are led by us. There are many of them that are out there. Like, we've provided some of those names. You can also find them online with like a quick or not so quick Google, and see what they are up to. What are they fundraising for? What events are they planning? What kinds of activities are happening? Plug in, because that's how you build relationships and meet people, is by showing up and showing that you are invested in that community's success and that work. And I do mean to, be very clear about that. Everyone doesn't have the same capacity. Don't rush to join 20 groups that you do not have capacity to join. But being careful and deliberate with your time and your capacity, and knowing I want to prioritize time to learn about and engage with this community, gives you the opportunity to decide how you can responsibly engage with the community and start building those relationships.
Word. Thank you. Thank you. That was all tremendous, tremendous food for thought. I think there is a lot here. Thank you all. Laura, Oluwatobi, Lydia, Sam, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for all in attendance. The webinar will be posted on our website, and we hope you all will join us in the future for our future Rethinking Research series. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a good day. Take care of yourselves, take care of your community, and be good to each other. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.